There are places in the world where water slows down, spreads out, and covers the land in shallows. In these calm, undisturbed conditions, plants have evolved in many special ways to thrive. From saltwater mangroves along the tropical coasts to the bogs and peatlands of the subarctic, these flooded lands accompany every biome and climate zone on Earth. Their ecosystems are among the richest and most complex to be found anywhere. I hope you brought your waders. You'll need them as we enter the world's wetlands. Wetlands are regions of the planet that have sluggish or standing water at relatively shallow depths that allow the growth of plant material. They can occur in freshwater, such as river floodplains, saltwater, such as in mangroves, or interfaces between the two, such as in river deltas. They occur in practically every parent biome on Earth, from the equator to the polar regions, and unlike the biomes that we have covered so far in this series, are much more decoupled from climate, with the presence of shallow, undisturbed water being the dominant influence. They are highly biodiverse areas in terms of both plant and animal species, and for this and other reasons to be revealed, are of global importance. The interface of water above land creates a very complex picture in terms of plant and soil systems, and so this work should only be seen as a summary guide to provide a beginner's overview to the subject, and through imagery provide some reality to you on it. Such complexity reveals itself immediately with a myriad of terms used to describe such places. In the English language alone there are almost a dozen: swamp, mire, moor, marsh, muskeg, mangrove, flat, fen, and bog. Some of these overlap, and most are historical terms that modern ecologists have attempted to corral into tighter technical definitions. In general, wetlands vary depending upon the salinity and mineral content of the water, as well as overall temperature ranges. Starting with the most salinity, we have mangroves and salt marshes, both of which occur in coastal areas where the salinity is more or less that of seawater. Both occur in areas protected from wave action that would otherwise disturb the settlement and germination of plant seeds. Mangroves are found within the tropics and some subtropical areas provided no frosts occur. They are characterized by a thick covering of salt-tolerant tree and shrub species, and some species have roots that stick up out of the mud like spikes so that the plant can breathe at low tide. Examples of extensive mangrove forests are the Sundarbans of the Ganges Delta in India and Bangladesh, the Niger Delta in West Africa, and the Orinoco River Delta in Venezuela. Salt marshes are found in sheltered coastal areas outside of the tropics that are free from ice, namely temperate regions where the area is regularly flooded with seawater at high tide. They are formed from salt-tolerant herbs, grasses, and sometimes low shrubs that are able to bind sediments that flow into the area and so stabilize the marsh, allowing it to grow. As sediments play a key role, they are typically found in river estuaries, but may also occur on the leeward side of barrier islands and spits of land. Examples of such marshes are the Camargue at the estuary of the Rhone River in southern France, the Mississippi Delta, and the Wash of eastern England. In rivers upstream from salt marshes are found tidal freshwater marshes, where tides further downstream result in the freshwater of the river backing up and flooding, and so do not directly see salt water. These are commonly found in large temperate estuaries that experience significant tides, such as the St. Lawrence of eastern Canada and the Severn of Great Britain. The last category of coastal wetlands that experience seawater or tidal influences are the intertidal flats. These are flat areas subject to tides that are too unstable in terms of sediments and so remain unvegetated. Morecambe Bay in the northwest of England is an example of this. Inland freshwater wetlands come in many forms and differ in terms of the source of water, whether they produce peat, whether they are forested or not, and whether they are flooded seasonally or year-round. Freshwater marshes are large, non-forested flat areas that are either continuously or frequently flooded, but which have water flowing through them. Because this water circulates, acidity does not build up in the decomposing dead plant material, and so does not form peat. I'll touch on that more in a moment. The primary vegetation here is grasses and sedges, along with emergent plants, those with soft stems that are highly adapted to saturated conditions. Reeds, also known as bulrushes or cattails, are a common sight here too. The largest freshwater marsh is arguably the world's most famous wetland, the Everglades of southern Florida. Another notable wetland of this type occurs at the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in southern Iraq. The Mesopotamian marshlands have been home to people for thousands of years, but in the 1980s and 90s the vast majority of these were drained for political and economic reasons, and are today only 10% of their former size. Freshwater forested swamps have similar water dynamics to the marshes just covered, in that they are large flat areas that are either permanently or frequently flooded with fresh water. The difference is that the primary vegetation is trees instead of grasses and sedges. They occur in tropical and temperate regions. The largest of these is one of the largest wetlands in the world, and that is the central part of the Amazon River basin that floods over an enormous area for months during the wet season. This flooding accounts for the wider distribution of evergreen forest compared to the smaller area of tropical rainforest climate, areas that have a notable dry season, with either tropical monsoon or savanna climates still have evergreen rainforest instead of the seasonal forest that sees the loss of leaves in the dry season. This is because the flooding lasts well into the dry season and provides sufficient water for the trees to continue growing during this time. Equally as notable are the numerous and iconic flooded forests of the eastern United States, which extend from Maine down the eastern seaboard and along the Gulf states to Texas. They are the product of flat plains combined with plenty of rain from the humid subtropical climate. In the north, red maples dominate, while in the south, Atlantic white cedars make up much of the shallower swamps. Deeper swamps in the south see cypress trees dominating. The largest wetland in Europe is part forested swamp and part freshwater marsh. Known as the Pripyat or Pinsk marshes, it straddles the border of Belarus and Ukraine. Like most swamps, it is relatively impenetrable and was historically significant in both world wars in slowing and dividing invading forces into northern and southern groups. Related to the freshwater marshes and forested swamps are the riparian wetlands. Riparian simply means of a riverbank, and these wetland types center around a river which will regularly burst its banks for part of the year. It can be argued that the Amazon wetlands are of this type. There is a degree of overlap in terms of classification. A clear example of a river-dominated wetland, however, is that of the Mississippi, or rather was, for almost all of the riparian wetlands that extended as far as 50 miles on each side of the river for up to 500 miles along its lower length have disappeared over the last 200 years. The reasons are obvious. Such a long, navigable river, reaching from the sea far into the continental north, was always going to be an economic power line. And so the towns and cities that grew up on its banks needed protection from the regular, damaging floods. Levees, or protective embankments, sprang along its length, keeping the water in and eventually leading to the draining of the wetlands, whose fertile soils were converted to farmland. That vast area can still be seen outlined today. The most notable wetland of this type that still survives is the vast seasonally flooded basin at the tri-point of Brazil, Bolivia and Paraguay, known as the Pantanal. Chances are that you've seen this in wildlife documentaries, and for good reason, as it has one of the richest ecosystems in the world. It is regarded as the largest tropical wetland area and is the largest flooded grassland in the world. And then there is the Sud of southern Sudan, a vast flooded grassland and inland delta into which the Nile River, flowing north, slows to a crawl, spreading out across thousands of square miles. This area is historically significant, as despite their might and sophistication, neither ancient Egypt nor the Roman Empire were able to penetrate its endless channels in the search for the source of the Nile. While we're on that river, no discussion of global wetlands would be complete without a mention of the lower reaches and the end of that mighty watercourse, the Nile Delta. Since records began, that vast delta area has been irrigated and cultivated to feed the large population of Egypt, and so we have no way of knowing for sure what the original form of that wetland delta was. Every year, the deluge from the rainy season in the tropical savanna of the East African highlands would flow into the Nile, find its way north through the Sud, and continue into Egypt, where the river would burst its banks. The water spilling out onto the floodplain south of the delta as well as within it would provide mineral-rich silt that fertilized the land and allowed for bountiful harvests year after year. This is perhaps the most notable example of a riparian system influencing an entire civilization. The yearly floods ended with the construction of the Aswan Dam in the 1960s, and so, like the Mississippi, this river was finally tamed by humans, and the last vestige of natural wetlands came to an end. As we come to the last two types of wetland, bogs and fens, it's time to talk about peat. Many wetland areas have the right conditions for the formation of this acidic concentrate of dead plant material, which is in fact the first stage in the formation of coal. It is formed when dead plant material, most of which is moss, falls to the bottom and becomes compressed as further layers accumulate on top of it. As the water obstructs the flow of oxygen and as acids form to produce an almost vinegary level of pH, normal bacterial processes are inhibited and so decomposition is very slow. As a result, most of the carbon in the original plant is preserved instead of being lost as CO2 as occurs in more regular rates of decomposition. Consequently, peatlands act as significant carbon sinks, and it is believed that as much as 30% of all carbon in the biosphere is trapped in peat. Bogs and fens are both peat-producing, with bogs being the most productive in this regard. They differ from each other in that bogs get their water directly from rain or snowmelt, and so the water has low mineral content, which means little neutralization of acids in decomposition. Fens, by contrast, get their water additionally from streams or groundwater, and so the water has higher mineral content and a greater ability to neutralize acids, leading to slower peat formation. Peatlands can occur anywhere in the world where there is decaying plant matter that is left in stagnant water. The largest peatland of the tropics is believed to be the Cuvette Centrale of Congo, found on either side of the vast Congo River as it arcs southwest toward the capital of Kinshasa. It is one of the least researched and poorly understood of all the world's wetlands. In the temperate regions, one of the most well-known peatland areas is that of the western part of Ireland, where heavy rain combined with post-glacial depressions and forest clearance millennia ago have led to the production of extensive bogs that make up about 1/6 of the entire island. In addition to typical bogs and lower elevations, the forest clearances in the uplands led to the colonization of these areas with heather, turning the soil more acidic and resulting in slower plant decomposition and the accumulation of peat. With Ireland being the most deforested country in Europe, firewood was scarce, and so such peat was a vital source of fuel for home heating for centuries. But the largest stretches of peatland occur in the subarctic, namely Alaska, Canada, northern Scandinavia and Siberia. The subarctic has so many of these wetlands for a number of reasons. Being glaciated in previous ice ages, the land is relatively flat, and till, that is, rocky material carried by the ice, would be deposited unevenly, forming depressions that could then gather water after the ice age was over. In the cool subarctic summers, low evaporation rates mean any ice melt or rain stays around longer. And finally, poor drainage brought on by permafrost, a layer of soil that is frozen either year-round or for part of the year, acts as a barrier to drainage, and so water builds up above and often floods the surface. The largest wetland in North America is the Hudson Bay lowland, a mix of peat bogs, fens and saltwater marshes fringing the whole southern edge of Hudson Bay. The largest wetland region of any kind in the world is probably the West Siberian lowland that encompasses an area about half the size of the United States. It runs east from the Ural Mountains over a vast and extremely flat plain to the Yenisei River about 1,500 kilometers to the east, and from the Arctic Ocean to about 1,200 kilometers south. The area is covered in an endless patchwork of bogs and fens, interspersed with soggy boreal forest or taiga, and outside of the winter was essentially impenetrable until the mid-20th century. One last region of wetlands worth mentioning is the prairie pothole region that runs from Alberta down to Iowa in North America. As its name suggests, this region of the North American prairie is covered in thousands of pothole depressions formed by uneven deposition of glacial till during the last ice age. These potholes fill with water in the spring and many evaporate by summer, but some are permanent. As they don't quite fit the description of any of the above types, this final point goes to demonstrate that wetland habitats are as complex and varied as the Earth is in terms of topography, hydrology, and biology. Once viewed as wastelands that could be drained to produce valuable fertile farmland, wetlands outside of the Arctic have shrunk dramatically over the last few centuries, and those still surviving have often been affected by runoff of fertilizer and pollutants which, in a slow-moving or stagnant water system, can significantly disrupt the ecosystem. More recently, this trend has continued in the tropics, but in developed nations, public awareness of the importance of their rich ecosystems has resulted in a shift of attitude over the last 50 years, with the result that most are now protected from drainage. Between 10 and 20% of all bird species globally are believed to be dependent upon wetlands, making them the most dependent of all the animal kingdoms. By comparison, only 2% of mammals are wetland dependent. And so reduction in wetland areas puts a stress in particular on bird populations. The Ramsar Convention, originally signed in 1971, but which meets every 3 years, has created a list of over 2,000 wetlands globally that are of importance, and signatory countries work to ensure that these remain protected. Lastly, as mentioned, many wetlands act as carbon sinks through the capture of CO2 into plant matter, which, when dead, is locked into the peat. If these peatlands are disturbed, then this carbon is released once more into the atmosphere and may contribute further to climate change. It is easy to forgive humans for wanting to turn these unproductive areas into land that can work for them by draining them to produce farmland or for urban development. But like any species that ultimately wants to survive, it's important that we find the right balance between nature and development. Let us hope that our realization of the importance of these wetland areas has not come too late. The world would be a poorer place without them. And that's the wetlands. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to this fascinating and complex set of biomes. It is a big subject, and I am sure that some of you will want to mention a particular wetland of significance that I did not cover. Feel free to do so in the comments. Don't forget to check out the website. I have provided a link in the description to this particular video with the full transcript and additional high-resolution maps available. If you haven't done so already, then please click the subscribe button so you don't miss future episodes. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay dry.